The Labour MP Keith Vaz resigns as chairman of an influential committee of MPs after newspaper allegations about his private life. Mr Vaz said he'd decided to quit his role on the Home Affairs Select Committee after claims he paid for the services of 2 male sex workers. We'll have the latest from Westminster on this breaking story, also this lunchtime. More than 100 flights at London's City Airport are cancelled or diverted after protesters block the runway. One of Britain's most notorious radical clerics, Anjem Choudary, is being sentenced this lunchtime. The retailer Sports Direct says it's changing its working practices for staff after admitting serious shortcomings. And Andy Murray breezes through into the quarterfinals of the US Open as he records his fastest ever serve.
In the south, driving forward plans for a 30-mile stretch of the hard shoulder on the M4 in Berkshire to become a 4th lane have been approved. And the harvest that's hopping along nicely. We're at a Surrey brewery that's seen a boom in demand for these.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. The Labour MP Keith Vaz has just announced he has quit as chairman of the influential House of Commons Home Affairs Select Committee. His decision follows newspaper allegations that he paid for the services of 2 male sex workers. In a statement, Mr Vaz said he was genuinely sorry that recent events meant he could no longer continue in the role, but he said those who hold others to account must themselves be accountable. Well, let's go straight to Westminster and our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. Norman.
Sophie, all morning the pressure has been mounting on Keith Vaz to go, and in the last few minutes he has announced he will resign as chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee, saying he does not want to damage or distract from the work of the committee, stressing the importance of the integrity of the Select Committee system and saying those who hold others to account must themselves be accountable. My colleague Eleanor Garnier has been following this morning's dramatic developments.
Keith Vaz, vote Labour next Thursday.
He's the longest-serving British Asian MP.
Vaz Keith Anthony is
First elected in Leicester East for Labour back in 1987. He rose the ranks to become the Europe Minister in Tony Blair's government.
Mr Brand, I have a final question for you.
And in recent years, he's become well known for his role as chair of the powerful Home Affairs Select Committee, with many well-known figures and politicians facing his scrutiny. But after allegations in a Sunday paper involving Mr Vaz and male escorts, he came under pressure to step down.
Welcome to the Daily Politics.
A local Conservative councillor in Leicester said he should quit as an MP too.
I think Keith needs to consider where does he think this could eventually end up,
right.
And actually would he be doing the public and Parliament a service by actually and his family by standing down now.
But others say Mr Vaz deserves another chance.
Don't judge somebody on one mistake they make in their life or even a couple of mistakes. I mean, it's the total that he's done for other people right the way in his own constituency and up and down Britain. He's always been on the side of justice, and that can't just all be swept away by one mistake that he's made.
Mr Vaz has referred the allegations to his lawyers. There's no suggestion he's done anything illegal. The issue is how damaging the claims are to his credibility and political career. Eleanor Garnier, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, Norman, he issued his statement a short time ago. Was it inevitable?
Well, Sophie, Keith Vaz is one of Parliament's great survivors. He's brushed aside previous controversies, and all the signs were that he was going to come in front of his committee today and defend himself vigorously, arguing that he hadn't broken the law, he was entitled to a private life, and the newspaper that broke the story had paid the prostitutes to make their claims. But all the signs were his position was becoming untenable. Conservative MPs on the committee said it was simply not credible that he could continue to chair inquiries into things like drugs, the prostitution and the police, and they were threatening to trigger a vote of no confidence in his leadership. Significantly, though, a Labour member of the committee told me that Labour MPs too wanted a clean break and were unwilling to back him. faced with that, I suspect Mr. Vaz decided it was better to go voluntarily than to be the first select committee chairman in modern history to be deposed from his committee.
Norman Smith with the latest. Thank you. More than 100 flights into and out of London's City Airport were cancelled or diverted this morning after protesters breached airport security and gained access to the runway. 9 people chained themselves together in the middle of the runway, halting all flights for 6 hours. The activists from the campaign group Black Lives Matter say they were highlighting the UK's environmental impact on the lives of black people, but their protest has also highlighted security issues at the airport. Our correspondent Frankie McCamley is outside City Airport for us now. Frankie.
Well, things should be getting back to normal here following that protest that lasted nearly 6 hours this morning. Now out here on the runway, that has reopened, but inside the terminal, it's a very different picture. There are huge queues and lots of disgruntled passengers following the events that took place this morning. Just before 6 o'clock this morning, 9 Black Lives Matter protesters made their way onto the runway at London City Airport. Locking themselves together and attaching themselves to a tripod, officers spent hours negotiating with the group before making arrests. It's not clear how the protesters got onto the runway. Some reports suggest they may have swum across the Thames to get there.
We've called for a shutdown of London City Airport because the climate crisis is a racist crisis. From Newham to New Orleans, time and again, we see the environmental costs of the aviation industry hitting working class communities of colour first and hardest. They're more likely to live beside airports, beside power plants, because they can't afford to live in places that aren't.
Police say 9 people have been held on suspicion of aggravated trespass, being unlawfully airside and breaching airport bylaws. Inside the terminal, big queues for passengers. Last year, a record 4.3 million people used the airport, which is popular with bankers and business professionals.
Just absolutely frustrating. We've been here for hours.
We managed to get in and through security and very quiet upstairs in the terminal. I think a lot of people had been told their flights were cancelled or had just thrown in the towel and gone home. So we're about to do the same thing. Fortunately, a bit of a wasted day.
This is not the first protest in the UK by the group Black Lives Matter. Last month, the protesters formed human blockages, bringing roads, trams and other transport links to a halt. All of the protesters were removed by around 11:30 this morning, but the event has raised serious security concerns here at the airport. Well, London City Airport say they want to get things back up and running as quickly as possible. In the last half an hour, we've seen 2 flights take off from here already, but inside the airport there are a lot of disgruntled passengers, a lot of people waiting to hear of news as what's happened to their delayed or cancelled flight. Anyone who is travelling from this airport is being advised to check with their airline before they travel.
Frankie, thank you. Meanwhile, British Airways has apologised to passengers for delays after an IT glitch hit check-in systems. Angry travellers complained of hours of queuing at airports in Europe and the US. Some passengers also complained about problems with online check-in. BA says flights are now checking in normally, but the process at Heathrow and Gatwick would be a bit slower than usual. The retailer Sports Direct says it will now offer staff working in its stores guaranteed hours instead of using controversial 0 hours contracts. The company says it will also ensure all warehouse staff are paid above the national minimum wage. It comes after the company was heavily criticised for its working practices, which were described as Victorian. Our business correspondent Theo Leggett reports.
More akin to a Victorian workhouse than a modern retailer. That was how MPs recently described working practices here at Sports Direct's main warehouse at Shirebrook in Derbyshire. Among the allegations, staff paid less than the minimum wage, being penalised for taking breaks to drink water or for taking time off sick. A recent BBC documentary heard claims there was a culture of fear within the company. Stuart Young was once a security guard there.
It feels like something out of Dickens, the way it's run. Finding urine in bottles in the warehouse because they've been told they can't go to the toilet unless it's their break time.
Now the company's produced its own report and made a number of promises. It says it has indeed identified serious shortcomings in the working practices at Shirebrook. It admits that a controversial 6 strikes and you're out disciplinary policy was a blunt instrument and should be suspended. And it says employees in its stores who are currently on 0-hours contracts will be offered guarantees of at least 12 hours work a week. But while that could affect 18,000 people, it won't apply to workers at Shirebrook, most of whom are employed by agencies.
Sports Direct insists its problems occurred simply because the business grew too far, too fast. It now says that it's putting in place new systems to ensure that in future all of its staff are treated with dignity, respect and fairness.
We'd still like to see the company go further, particularly have an independent review of corporate governance. So progress has been made. I applaud that. It would be churlish not to, but we'd still like to see more improvements being pledged.
Sports Direct is keen to point out the progress it's made over the past few weeks, but the company itself admits that it'll take far longer to improve the general culture within the Shirebrook warehouse and some other parts of the business. Theo Leggett, BBC News.
The radical Islamist cleric Anjem Choudary has just been sentenced to 5.5 years in prison after being convicted last month of inciting support for the terror group Islamic State. Counter-terrorism chiefs have spent almost 20 years trying to bring Choudary to justice, blaming him and the proscribed organisations which he helped to run for radicalising young men and women. Our Home Affairs correspondent June Kelly is at the Old Bailey now. June.
Well, Anjem Choudary and his co-defendant Mohammed Mizanur Rahman both given 5.5 years. They could have been given 10 years for this particular offence. Neither man showed any reaction as the judge handed down the sentence. But from the public gallery there was a shout of "God is great, Allahu Akbar." Now, the judge, Mr Justice Holroyd, said that Anjem Choudary had expressed contempt for the values of the democracy in which he lived. And he said that neither he nor Mohammed Mizanur Rahman had shown any remorse. For 20 years he was Anjem Choudary, radical preacher. Now he's Anjem Choudary, convicted terrorist. And his rare glimpses of the outside world are from the inside of a prison van.
They arrest you early in the morning for speaking the truth.
After 2 decades of rabble-rousing, Choudary was found guilty 6 weeks ago of inviting support for so-called Islamic State. Convicted with him was his right-hand man, Mohammed Mizanur Rahman, and today they were back at the Old Bailey for sentencing.
My name is Mr. Anjem Choudary.
Anjem Chowdary's toxic message took root beyond the UK. Here he was addressing supporters in Holland.
I come from England in order to radicalise the youth in this country.
In Britain, Luton was one of Chowdary's fertile recruiting grounds. Some of his followers from here have, like him, recently been convicted over their support for IS. At the town's Al-Hira Mosque, they're working hard to counter the propaganda. This is a class for 13 to 16-year-olds. For most of the boys, we're not showing their faces to protect their identities.
Before we start today's lesson, what do you know about ISIS?
They try to persuade other people, young people, try to convince them that they're right, and because they're using guns and flags and symbols of Islam, but in the wrong way.
That's how we should deal with all the peaceful non-Muslims. Even they do not believe what you believe, it does not mean that you start hating them.
Here they think it's vital to have an open discussion so that young Muslims are then equipped to challenge the extremists.
We should have an ideological battle with these people, and this is what we're doing. We're teaching young people how to intellectually debate and dialogue with these extremists, and if they come to you, how to say, look, I know what the right path is, I'm not going to follow you, my teachers have taught me what the right path is.
They're tired of terrorists like Anjem Choudary using Islam to justify what they say and do. He'll begin his sentence at Belmarsh Prison in southeast London. He'll be held with other especially dangerous inmates in the jail's high security unit. Well, the fact that Chowdhury will be held in Belmarsh's high security unit, which is effectively a prison within a prison, means that he will have access to a limited number of inmates. But nevertheless, the challenge for the authorities is to stop this arch manipulator becoming a figure of influence behind bars.
June Kelly, thank you. More than 200 people have been prosecuted for what's known as revenge porn, sending private sexual images of someone without their consent. That's since a new law was introduced in England and Wales last year. Figures from the Crown Prosecution Service also show that prosecutions and convictions for sexual offences, child abuse and domestic violence reached a new high in the year to March. Katrina Renton reports.
Significant moment that I can remember.
Rachel Williams was abused by her former husband.
I was physically and mentally abused for 18 years. Anything from hot food thrown at me, slight punches to the back of the head. Dan's favourite, he used to grab me by the jaw and squeeze so hard he'd leave his fingertips on my jaw, and mental abuse as well. He's sort of in a bubble, really. I could call it a domestic abuse bubble. Until you sort of get out of it, you don't really see the impact and the effect and the damage it actually has on you.
Well, this is our statement.
While today's report suggests more people are coming forward, many will never want to report their abuser, often their partner, to the police.
We have to accept that many survivors will never want to involve the criminal justice system. Sometimes they simply don't feel it's safe to do that. You have to remember that on average, a woman has experienced 35 incidents of abuse before she goes to the police. We've got to bring that number down, and that means A, improving the police response, but B, giving her other opportunities so that other professionals are equipped to provide help at an earlier stage.
Last year, domestic abuse, rape and sexual offences accounted for 18.6% of the Crown Prosecution Service's workload. More than 100,000 people were prosecuted for domestic abuse. 75% of these cases resulted in a conviction. And 206 people were prosecuted under a new law targeted at people who upload sexual images of others without consent, dubbed revenge porn.
It's very difficult to know if the offences are on the increase. Certainly people reporting them are on the increase, which is good. And certainly I think social media is a new way in which people can commit to these offences. It's quick, it's easy, people often don't think about what they are doing and the consequences. But equally, what people don't appreciate is it gives us a good audit trail. There's evidence there that we can then use and put before the court, which is really very strong.
Since December, 5 people were prosecuted for another new offence, controlling or coercive behaviour. One of them was a man who wouldn't let his partner leave the house or go to the toilet without his permission. While much of the focus is on girls and women, these figures also include men and boys. Campaigners say no matter how encouraging today's report is, these crimes are still very much underreported. Katrina Renton, BBC News.
The time is just after 1:15. The top story this lunchtime. The Labour MP Keith Vaz has resigned as chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee after newspaper allegations about his private life. And coming up, easy to construct but as strong as an ox, how it's hoped that this flat pack truck will transform lives in the developing world.
In South today, the road ahead, plans for a 30-mile stretch of the hard shoulder on the M4 in Berkshire to become a 4th lane have been approved. And will she have the winning shot? We meet the Paralympic hopeful who's in Rio ahead of her first ever Games.
Now, he's the man who designed one of the world's most coveted supercars, and now he's turned his hand to a vehicle designed to transform life in the developing world. Gordon Murray, who built the McLaren F1, was asked to come up with a small truck that can be built from a flat pack. It's cheap and easy to build, yet tough enough to cope with conditions across many parts of Africa and Asia. It's called the Ox, and our transport correspondent Richard Westcott has been along to have a test drive.
It doesn't look like it could tackle some of the worst roads on Earth. On the surface, the Ox could be any other truck until you put it through its paces. This vehicle sort of doesn't make sense when you look at it. It's just an ordinary looking van. It's got these tiny little wheels. It's 2-wheel drive, and yet I'm driving it over what could easily be a dry riverbed in Africa. It's really rocky, And frankly, it's doing it as well as a 4x4 would do it. In some ways, it's actually more comfortable.
Believe it or not, the man who designed it also made this. The McLaren F1 is a supercar for the super rich. Ox drivers have very different needs.
Well, when we studied the requirements for where this vehicle is going to end up, there is a requirement for loading livestock. If you hold it there, loading livestock and barrels of fuel and water.
Now, you've designed what some people think is the best sports car ever made. You had all those years in Formula One. How does this rank in terms of how hard it was to design and how proud you are of it?
I know it's probably difficult to believe, but for me, this ranks above everything else I've ever done. Designing expensive sports cars, that reaches a few people. This thing will help. This goes into mass production. This will help thousands of people with mobility.
Was it harder than designing the McLaren F1?
I think in a way this is a much more difficult challenge than the F1 was.
Crucially, it flat packs like furniture, so it's cheaper to transport. 3 semi-skilled people can build it in under 12 hours with basic tools. Every part's designed to be easy to fix. All essential requirements for the man who first dreamt up the plan.
Once you understand that people all over Africa and Asia and in different places have no access to motor cars, then you understand immediately why these communities in Africa and these places are so poor.
For the next step, he now hopes to make 1,000 without making a profit. Richard Westcott, BBC News.
A former taxi driver has gone on trial for the murder of a young woman who went missing 14 years ago. Becky Godden's body was found in a field in Gloucestershire 8 years after she disappeared. 52-year-old Christopher Halliwell is appearing at Bristol Crown Court. He denies murder. Our correspondent John Kay is there for us now. John.
Yes, Sophie, we've heard in court this morning that Becky Godden was last seen by members of her family at the end of 2002. We heard that her life had been chaotic before she vanished, that she'd been taking Class A drugs, that she'd been on the streets as a sex worker. The prosecution says that nearly a decade later, so in 2011, her body was found in a field in Gloucestershire, what was described as the middle of nowhere. And Becky's mum wept in court here today as details of how her remains were uncovered and discovered were read out to the jury. Now, the prosecution claims that police officers were taken to that exact spot by Christopher Halliwell. He's the man who's gone on trial here today. They claim that this former taxi driver was arrested, that he told police that he'd picked up a young woman on the streets of Swindon, that he'd had sex with her, strangled her and then disposed of her body. He was charged with murder, but he denies murder, and that's what this trial is all about. Now, the judge told the jury that Christopher Halliwell had decided, as is his right, to represent himself during this trial, and he's sitting there in the dock surrounded by legal books and by documents. The judge told the jury that it was entirely his right to do so and that they shouldn't make any decisions or judgments about that decision during the case. The jury have also been told that Christopher Halliwell has admitted murdering another young woman in Swindon, a woman called Sian O'Callaghan, in 2011. But again, the judge says they shouldn't take anything from that. The prosecution says there are similarities. That will be up for the jury to decide in this case. So Christopher Halliwell pleads not guilty to the murder of Becky Godden. This trial due to last about another month.
John Kay, thank you. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon will set out her government's legislative plans for the coming year today, and she's expected to place education at its heart. Our correspondent Lorna Gordon is at the Scottish Parliament for us now. Lorna.
Yes, Sophie, the big question on many people's lips is independence. Will she mention that possible second referendum? Well, I think it's likely to be mentioned by Nicola Sturgeon, but only in passing. This very much a programme for government which will focus on the hard graft of turning the SNP's manifesto into reality.
This is brilliant. I can't believe it's going to be a football pitch.
In Edinburgh early this morning, Nicola Sturgeon toured Boroughmuir High School, a new school building with new facilities set to open early next year. Scotland's First Minister has said repeatedly she wants to be judged on her record on education, closing the attainment gap, channeling money directly to head teachers, and improving the buildings in which Scotland's children are taught.
This is a construction project, one of 29 new schools that will open over the course of next year, providing a real boost to the economy, particularly the construction industry, but also making sure that young people are learning in fit-for-purpose, state-of-the-art surroundings.
More details are also expected today on how the Scottish Government intends to widen access to universities and colleges. Further social security powers have been devolved to Scotland. It's possible there'll be more on how they'll be administered. And more apprenticeships, one move to try to encourage economic growth. The Conservatives say the First Minister needs to focus more on day-to-day issues like these, rather than the Constitution.
Nicola Sturgeon has put the independence question right back on the agenda here in Scotland, and that's been to the detriment of our public services, our schools, our hospitals, our police force. It's also a big question mark over the Scottish economy, and today the Scottish Conservatives will be laying out our priorities for government, including how we improve the Scottish economy and how we take independence off the table.
It could be a tricky balancing act going forward, some commentators say.
At the moment, it seems to me a bit like Nicola Sturgeon wants to be safe. She doesn't want to scare people. Maybe she has a second independence referendum on her mind and she doesn't want to put off voters ahead of that.
Taking effective steps to stimulate the economy at a time when Scotland's balance sheet looks weak. No lack of challenges for Nicola Sturgeon ahead of any possible future calls for another referendum on independence. Well, we are told that Europe will be a common theme in everything the Scottish Government does going forward. As to the exact details of that programme for government, we'll find out what Nicola Sturgeon has to say when she stands up in the chamber in the Scottish Parliament behind me in around an hour's time.
Lorna, thank you. Tennis now, and Andy Murray is through to the quarter-finals at the US Open. He swept through after losing just 5 games in his match against Grigor Dimitrov and recorded his fastest ever serve of 141 miles an hour. And there was another record for world number 1 Serena Williams, as our sports correspondent Joe Wilson reports.
New York provides the fanfare and the funky camera swooping around the star. Andy Murray just plays. Exaggeration isn't in his vocabulary, so when he says he played extremely well, he really did. Murray's in the black shorts, winning the points.
Through the eye of a needle.
He dropped 5 games against Grigor Dimitrov, that's 5 games in the whole match. Murray's serve sizzled, quicker than ever. This ace was okay, he actually managed one 3 miles an hour faster. Dimitrov seeded 22, Murray 2. 20 places between them looked like 200.
Wow.
Quarter-final here, Davis Cup semi-final later this month. Murray's better than ever. Oh, just routine.
Yeah, it was a really good match. I think Grigor played his best, but I didn't really give him a chance to get into the match.
Yeah, simple. Well, this is the greatest Grand Slam player of all time if you count matches won.
Games to the match.
That's the 308th time we've heard that in Grand Slams, a record. Yaroslava Shevdova defeated, another quarter-final for Serena Williams. Sleeves of shocking pink, tennis of predictable brilliance. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
And finally, the Paralympic Games get underway in Rio tomorrow, and there are high hopes for more medal success. The GB team won 120 medals at London 2012, and 4 years later, it's hoped the athletes can bring back another medal haul. Our sports correspondent Andy Swiss reports.
Taking aim for Paralympic glory. At their Brazilian training base, the British team are making their final push for Rio. The preparations are almost done. The challenge is to follow this. London 2012 forged an array of new stars and took Paralympic sport to a different level. So 4 years on, will it be another Golden Games?
London made such massive steps, putting us in everybody's house and making us household names. And Rio really needs to uphold that. And it's going to be a challenge, obviously, but as long as the athletes put the best performances in that they can, then that's what a successful Games is.
3, 2, 1, go. Come on, up!
As well as the big names, there are new faces. About half the British team are making their Paralympic debut. Among them, Kadina Cox in both cycling and athletics, Maria Lyle, who's aiming for a sprint double at just 16 years of age, and former Marine Jo Townsend, a medal hope in the Games' first ever triathlon competition.
The target for Britain's Paralympians here is to do what Britain's Olympians did, win more medals than they did in London. That means at least 121 with what is a smaller team than 4 years ago, and of course, no home advantage.
History tends to show that it's very difficult to go to your next away games and repeat that level of performance. So it's a challenging target, but I think that the results over the last couple of seasons especially really point towards this being a pretty special team.
Turns, scores! That's the golden goal!
And of course, British athletes in Rio haven't done too badly so far this summer. So barely a fortnight after that first gold rush, could there be a second?
Olympic champion, gold medal.
On Copacabana, the Olympic rings have been replaced by the Paralympic agitos. The stage is set for yet more sporting drama. Andy Swiss, BBC News, Rio.
Time for a look at the weather here now with Louise Lear. Hello.
Hi there, Sophie. Well, everybody is talking, or perhaps I should say moaning, about the feel of the weather at the moment, aren't they? It's very warm, it's very humid out there, and it was an incredibly mild night. Just how mild? We'll take a look at some of the overnight lows. 19, 20 degrees in some places, and that's way higher than where they should be as a nighttime minimum. This is the average in September. Some areas barely staying into double digits. So, yes, it was a muggy night. A lot of cloud around, but our weather watchers have managed to find some sunshine to show you. A beautiful start into Cheshire. Generally speaking, as we go through the day, we keep the risk of some sunny spells coming through, and it's going to be a warm, humid story. That's the main theme to our weather. So the cloud breaking up from time to time across England and Wales. Beautiful afternoon in the northeast of Scotland, but from the satellite picture you can see the cloud thick enough across Scotland and Northern Ireland for the odd spot or two of light drizzle here. So temperatures not altering too much here, but we could see 23 degrees across eastern Scotland. Very nice indeed, and not quite as humid to the north of that drizzly rain. To the south, though, yes, it is humid. The cloud breaking up, some sunshine continuing to come and go through the afternoon, and temperatures responding. Highs generally of around 23 to 24 or 25 degrees. Now, as we go through the overnight, unfortunately, we pretty much do it all again. The band of drizzly rain drifts a little bit further north. That allows the humidity to push right across the country. So it is going to be another incredibly mild night for sleeping. Maybe the return of a little bit of coastal mist and murk, but overnight lows, again, high teens, possibly 20. But there is a change coming. Low pressure waiting out in the wings, and the high, well, that just drifts a little bit further east into the near continent, and that allows a subtle change in wind direction. Drier air coming across the land from the continent, and that potentially could break up the cloud that we're going to see on Wednesday. So more sunshine coming through on Wednesday. A dry story for most of us. Just a few scattered showers up into the far north and west, and a bit more of a breeze. Here, temperatures a little more subdued, but elsewhere, 19 to 21 degrees to Scotland and Northern Ireland. Perhaps 27, perhaps too hot for some of you. That's 80 degrees into the southeastern corner. Then the low arrives on Wednesday evening and into Thursday morning, bringing some wet and windy weather just to the northwest of the UK, but it's a cold front, and as it starts to push in, it will introduce slightly fresher air. Ahead of it, though, in the southeast, we keep that sunshine and still the potential here to see the warmth. 24 or 25, not out of the question, but noticeably fresher feel to the north and west. Sophie.
Louise, thank you. A reminder now of our main story this lunchtime. In the last hour, the Labour MP Keith Vaz has announced that he is quitting as chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee after newspaper allegations about his private life. That's all from us. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Good afternoon.